The sun had barely risen, but it already felt like the world was on fire. The air was thick with heat, and the harsh wind was pushing against her body like an unforgiving beast. Rebecca's eyes snapped open, and for a split second, she didn't know where she was. Panic surged through her veins as she gasped for breath, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something big, was about to happen. She tried to stand, but her legs were stiff and unresponsive, pinned by a tangle of tree roots. Her heart raced as she realized she wasn't alone. The eerie silence was broken only by the sounds of distant howls and the rustling of branches. She had no memory of how she ended up here, in the middle of this dense and unforgiving forest. Was this a nightmare? Or had something much worse happened? Her stomach churned with fear as she slowly began to recollect the night before, the hike she had gone on alone to escape the chaos of her life. A decision that now seemed like the most foolish thing she had ever done. Rebecca tried to calm herself. Her mind raced with questions. How did I get here? What happened to the others? But there was no time to dwell. With a deep breath, she pushed herself free from the roots and tried to stand. Her legs buckled, but she managed to catch herself on a nearby tree. Her body was battered, bruised, and exhausted, but she knew one thing: she had to survive. Looking around, she saw nothing but endless wilderness. The trees stretched out like towering giants, blocking her view of anything beyond. A wave of dizziness hit her, but she forced herself to focus. The last thing she remembered was a sudden storm, a violent storm that had swept in with no warning. She'd been caught in its fury, trying to find shelter, but something had gone wrong. The memory was hazy, like a broken dream. Rebecca's breath quickened as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. The forest was dense, the air humid, and the sounds of animals distant but constant. She could hear something moving, something large, rustling in the brush. Her heart rate spiked. She wasn't sure if it was an animal, another person, or something worse. She felt a chilling sensation crawl up her spine. Adrenaline shot through her, but she pushed the panic aside. Survival was the only thing that mattered now. She needed to find shelter, water, and food, or she would die here alone, her fate sealed by her own arrogance. Rebecca stumbled forward, each step taking all her strength. She couldn't let herself collapse. Not now. Her body was burning with exhaustion, and her mind was clouded with fear. But she couldn't afford to stop. If she didn't find help soon, she would be lost in the vast wilderness, at the mercy of whatever lay within it. She reached into her pocket, desperate to find something, anything that could help her. Her fingers brushed against a small, crumpled map she had brought with her, something she hadn't even thought about since the hike had started. She unfolded it shakily, her hands trembling. It was torn, partially soaked from the rain, and nearly impossible to read. But it was the only thing she had. She traced her finger along the trail she had been following, trying to make sense of where she had gone wrong. How did I end up so far off track? Her eyes scanned the map, but there was no answer. Only the blurry outline of the forest, with no markings for where help might be. Rebecca swallowed her fear and kept moving. The map was useless now, but she couldn't just stand there. She had to move forward, away from whatever dangers might be lurking behind her. As she trekked deeper into the forest, the temperature seemed to rise, the air becoming suffocating. The sound of rustling leaves grew louder, and she glanced over her shoulder, only to see nothing. Was she imagining it? Or was something following her? Suddenly, a loud snap of a branch broke the silence. Rebecca's heart leaped in her chest, and she froze, her breath caught in her throat. The noise had come from behind her. She wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she slowly turned around, expecting the worst. Nothing. She let out a slow breath, trying to steady her racing heart. But the tension remained, hanging in the air like a thick fog. She had to keep moving. She couldn't waste any more time looking over her shoulder. Whatever had made the noise wasn't her concern. Not yet. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, the thick roots of trees forcing her to slow down. The forest was relentless, pushing back against her every step. She stumbled forward, barely able to stay upright. The thought of food and water gnawed at her insides. She was thirsty, her mouth dry and cracked, and she couldn't remember the last time she had eaten. But finding water was just as important as finding shelter. She needed both to survive. Rebecca took a deep breath and tried to focus. She remembered the basics: find water, find shelter, and stay calm. But what if there was no water here? What if there was no hope? The crackling of leaves underfoot broke her thoughts. She turned quickly, her heart racing once more. But this time, it wasn't an animal. Instead, a figure appeared in the distance. A shadow against the thick backdrop of trees. For a moment, Rebecca froze, unsure of what to do. Was it a person? Or was this some twisted figment of her imagination? She tried to make out the figure, but the distance was too great, and the shadows too deep. Without thinking, she stumbled toward the figure, her instincts screaming at her to approach with caution. But as she drew closer, the shadow grew clearer. The figure was crouched on the ground, looking down at something in its hands. It was a man. Rebecca's heart pounded. She couldn't tell if he was real or just a hallucination from her exhaustion. But there was no time for doubt. She needed help. She had to take the risk. She took another step, but this time, the ground beneath her gave way. Her foot slipped, sending her tumbling forward. She braced herself for impact, but instead, her hands caught something soft. The ground beneath her had given way to a patch of moss, and for a moment, it was the only thing that felt real in this nightmarish world. She struggled to regain her footing, but quickly realized she wasn't alone anymore. The man had heard her fall and had turned to look at her, his eyes wide with shock. Rebecca was too exhausted to speak, too scared to make a sound. But the man didn't move. He simply stared at her, his face shadowed, his expression unreadable. The silence between them grew thick. Neither of them knew what to do next. The silence felt suffocating, like the forest itself had come alive and was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the man in front of her. The air seemed to thicken, and for a moment she thought she was imagining it. Was he real? She blinked rapidly, trying to focus. The man stood there, unmoving, his eyes fixed on her. A chill ran down her spine. There was something off about him, something she couldn't quite place. He was dressed in torn clothing, covered in dirt, and his face was gaunt, as if he hadn't eaten in days or weeks. His eyes, however, were the most unsettling part. They were wide, wild, and unblinking, like they had seen things that no one should ever have to see. Rebecca took a shaky step back. She had to stay calm. She had to think clearly. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. The words felt foreign to her as they left her mouth, but she needed to break the silence. She needed to know who this man was and whether he could help her. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly lowered his head, staring down at the ground as if something was hidden there. Rebecca's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs were weak, and she couldn't risk it. She had no idea where she was, and this could be the only person she encountered. She had to take the chance. Swallowing her fear, she tried again, her voice firmer. I need help. I've been lost. Please, can you help me?" Still, no answer. The tension in the air thickened, and Rebecca felt the weight of it pressing down on her chest. Her throat tightened, and her breath became shallow. Every nerve in her body told her to get out of there, but her mind was desperate. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't survive alone. Just as she was about to turn and flee, the man suddenly looked up, his eyes locking with hers. He spoke in a voice that was raspy and hollow, like a man long deprived of hope. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. His voice was barely audible, as if he was speaking more to himself than to her. "This place, it doesn't let people leave." Rebecca's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to hold her ground. She wasn't going to run. She needed answers. What do you mean? What place?" Her voice quivered with a mix of fear and confusion. The man didn't respond. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, his eyes flicking toward the trees as if he was expecting something, or someone, to appear. Rebecca followed his gaze, but saw nothing but shadows moving in the distance. He spoke again, but his words were cryptic, as though he had seen too much to articulate it properly. "They watch. They listen. They wait for you to give in." Rebecca's pulse quickened. Her mind raced with questions. Who was he talking about? Who was watching her? Who's watching? "What do you mean?" she demanded, her voice trembling more now with fear than with exhaustion. The man seemed to shrink back at her words, as if terrified by the very thought of answering. His gaze darted around nervously, and he shifted on his feet as if he were about to run. "Don't ask about them," he whispered, his voice shaking. "They'll find you too." Rebecca's mind was spinning. She needed to know what was going on, who was watching, and what the man meant by they. "Who are you? What's happening here?" she asked again, louder this time, her patience wearing thin. He flinched as if her words cut through him like a blade. The man seemed to gather what little strength he had left, finally meeting her gaze. "They don't let you leave," he muttered again, the words heavy with dread. "They take everyone who tries. Everyone who doesn't belong." His voice trailed off, and Rebecca could see the fear in his eyes. Real fear, the kind that was born from too many days spent hiding from something too powerful to confront. "Who are they?" Rebecca asked again, desperation creeping into her voice. But the man just shook his head, as if he couldn't bear to say it aloud. Instead, he took a step back, and for the first time, his expression softened. "Look, you need to leave." "It's not safe here," he urged. Rebecca's heart raced, and she instinctively took a step toward him, desperate for help. "Please, I don't know how to get out. I'm lost. I don't know what's going on. I need—" Before she could finish, the man suddenly turned away, his movements frantic. "You need to go," he repeated, his voice almost pleading. "No. You don't understand." But before Rebecca could ask him what he meant, a strange noise filled the air. A low growl, deep and primal, seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath them. It was the kind of sound that made your skin crawl, the kind that spoke of something monstrous lurking just beyond the veil. Rebecca's blood ran cold. The man's eyes widened in terror, and he spun back around, his hand gripping her arm with surprising strength. "Run," he whispered urgently. "Now." Rebecca barely had time to react before the man pulled her toward the trees, moving faster than she thought possible. Her legs felt heavy, but she forced herself to keep up. The growling sound grew louder, and then, as if to punctuate the terror, something crashed through the trees behind them. The sound of snapping branches was deafening, and Rebecca's pulse surged in her throat. She didn't dare look back. Her body was on autopilot, pumping adrenaline through her veins as she stumbled through the dense underbrush. Her mind was numb, her thoughts fragmented, but one thing was clear: she needed to survive. They ran for what felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. The forest seemed to close in around them, its twisted trees forming a labyrinth with no escape. The only thing that mattered was keeping ahead of whatever was pursuing them, and the man was relentless in his urgency, pulling her forward with a determination that terrified her. Suddenly, the man stopped dead in his tracks, his body going stiff as if he had run into an invisible wall. Rebecca stumbled into him, barely catching herself. She glanced around in confusion, trying to make sense of what had happened, but there was nothing. Then, she heard it. A soft whisper in the wind, like the voice of something calling to them from the depths of the forest. The trees shuddered as if the earth itself was waking up, shifting beneath them. Without warning, the man let out a strangled cry, his face twisted in horror. He turned to her with wide, frantic eyes. "Get away from me!" he shouted. "Don't look at them! Don't!" The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the trees around them groaned as if something was moving beneath them. Rebecca looked down just in time to see the earth crack open, a deep chasm forming between them and the man. With a horrifying scream, the man was swallowed whole, disappearing into the abyss below. Rebecca froze, her blood running cold. She could hear his screams echoing from the depths, but they were quickly silenced. And just like that, he was gone, vanished into the earth, as though he had never existed at all. Rebecca stood there, heart racing, trying to comprehend what had just happened. She couldn't. There was no time to process. The ground was still shaking, and the whispering voices grew louder. Something had come for the man, and now it was coming for her. Rebecca didn't wait to find out what was emerging from the earth. The ground continued to tremble as the whispering voices grew louder, the air thick with the promise of something evil. Her legs screamed in protest as she ran, her breath shallow and frantic. She had to keep moving or die. That was all she could think. The forest felt like it was alive now. Every branch, every shadow, every creaking of the trees felt like a warning. She could feel eyes on her, hidden just out of view, tracking her every movement. It was the kind of terror that rooted you to the spot, paralyzing you with fear. But she couldn't stop. She had seen what happened to the man, and she knew that if she slowed down, she would vanish just like him. Her breath was ragged as she pushed through the underbrush, branches scraping against her skin, leaves rustling like whispers in the wind. Her mind raced with panic. What was that thing? What did the man mean when he said they were waiting for her? Rebecca's thoughts swirled in a dark whirlpool of confusion and fear, but a part of her, the part that was still trying to survive, focused on the one thing that mattered: escape. She had to find shelter, or she'd be another lost soul in this twisted forest. Then, as if to mock her, the air changed. The whispering grew louder, the voices now unintelligible, swirling around her like a living thing. The world felt too close, too oppressive. She stumbled over a tree root and fell hard onto the ground, scraping her palms. Pain flared up her arms, but she couldn't afford to feel it. She pushed herself up, her legs trembling with exhaustion, and forced herself to keep moving. In the distance, she spotted something through the trees, a structure, half hidden by the forest's dense canopy. It looked like a ruin, a building that time had forgotten. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. Maybe there's shelter there. Maybe someone's there. She didn't hesitate. Her legs screamed as she ran toward it, her mind racing with hope and fear. She had to reach it. She had to get out of the forest. As she neared the ruin, the forest seemed to grow quieter, as if it was holding its breath. The air was thick with tension, and Rebecca's pulse quickened. Her eyes darted to the structure, an old stone building, its walls cracked and worn by time, but still standing. It was the kind of place that should have been abandoned long ago, yet here it was, looming over her, a ghost of the past. Rebecca reached the building's entrance, her heart pounding as she scanned the area for signs of life, or danger. There was no one around, but the silence felt wrong. The kind of silence that came just before something terrible happened. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should go in, but the voices were growing louder again, swirling in her ears, and she couldn't stand it. She stepped inside. The air inside the ruin was cool and musty, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the forest. The walls were lined with thick vines, and broken stone pillars jutted from the floor, making it feel as though the building was slowly being reclaimed by nature. But there was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. In the center of the room, she saw something strange, an altar, carved with symbols she didn't recognize. The symbols seemed to shimmer in the dim light, their edges flickering like they were alive. Rebecca's eyes widened as she moved closer, drawn to it by some inexplicable force. The air around the altar felt charged, as though the very atmosphere was alive with energy. The closer she got, the more she felt it, the weight of it. There was something ancient here, something powerful. Her fingers hovered over the stone, just inches away from it, when suddenly she froze. A whisper, sharp and cold, swept through her mind. "They're coming." Rebecca's breath hitched as the world around her seemed to twist. The ruin felt darker now, the shadows deeper, and the symbols on the altar seemed to glow with an unnatural light. Before she could react, the ground trembled again. The whispering voices grew louder, more frantic. The walls around her seemed to shift, bending and warping like they were alive, closing in on her. Panic surged through her as the reality of her situation crashed down on her. She wasn't alone. The altar, a relic from some ancient civilization, wasn't just a place of power. It was a trap. It was calling to them. The floor beneath her feet began to crack, fissures spreading outward like veins, glowing with an ominous, sickly light. Rebecca staggered back, her pulse pounding in her ears. The ruin was alive, and whatever was hidden within it was waking up. A low, guttural growl erupted from the shadows. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. She spun around, her eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing she could see. But she could feel it. Something was in the shadows, lurking, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The growl grew louder, closer. The air felt thick with dread, as though the very walls were closing in on her. The temperature dropped, her breath coming out in white puffs of cold air. She had no idea what was hunting her, but it was coming for her. Suddenly, something slammed into the side of the ruin, shaking the entire structure. Rebecca screamed, stumbling backward, her mind racing. She had no idea what it was, what it wanted. The growl became a roar, deafening and primal, shaking the foundation of the ruin. The entire building groaned under the force of whatever was coming for her, and Rebecca's heart hammered in her chest. Run. The word was a primal instinct, an impulse she didn't have to think about. She turned on her heel and bolted, crashing through the door of the ruin and back into the forest, the growls and roars following her. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shake with every step, the forest closing in on her from all sides. Rebecca had no idea where she was going, but she couldn't stop. She had no choice. She had to outrun whatever was hunting her. And then, as if in answer to her frantic flight, the forest opened up, revealing a path, a narrow, winding trail that seemed to lead deeper into the heart of the wilderness. She didn't hesitate. She ran down the path, the whispers still in her ears, growing louder with each step. The man's warning echoed in her mind, "They won't let you leave." Rebecca's breath came in ragged gasps, her legs aching with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. Not now. She didn't know what was following her or what was waiting for her at the end of this path, but there was no turning back. Whatever they were closing in on her, and it was only a matter of time before she would have to face them. Rebecca could hear the soft rustling of leaves behind her. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it was growing louder, closer. The path ahead was narrow, and the forest around her seemed to press in tighter with every step, as though the very trees were conspiring to keep her trapped. She had no idea what was hunting her, but it was no longer a distant presence. It was here, in the shadows, stalking her every move. And soon, it would find her. Her breath was ragged, her legs burning with exhaustion. She couldn't remember how long she had been running, how many twists and turns the path had taken, or whether she had even been going in the right direction. It didn't matter. She had to keep going. Survive. Keep moving. A sudden crash behind her, branches snapping under the weight of something massive, sent her heart into overdrive. She dared not look back, but her body screamed to turn around, to know what was chasing her. But she couldn't. She knew it would be worse if she did. Rebecca's foot caught on a root, and she stumbled, falling hard to the ground. Pain shot through her wrist as she broke her fall, but she barely registered it. Her mind was consumed with one thought: escape. She scrambled to her feet, but the forest seemed to be alive now, the shadows stretching toward her as if they wanted to swallow her whole. Her eyes scanned the path, and then she saw it, a break in the trees up ahead. A clearing. Hope surged in her chest, but it was quickly drowned by a rising sense of dread. There was no way out. Not really. Not here. As she neared the clearing, the air grew thick again, the whispers returning, louder now, urgent. The earth beneath her feet trembled with every step, the ground feeling unstable, as if it were about to split open. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, and she instinctively looked over her shoulder. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something, a shadow, flickering just beyond the trees. She wasn't sure if it was real, but the fear in her chest told her it was. Something was waiting for her. Something ancient, something hungry. She reached the edge of the clearing and skidded to a stop, her heart thudding in her chest. What she saw made her blood run cold. Before her stood a massive stone wall, covered in thick vines and moss, an impenetrable barrier. She had thought she was nearing safety, but now she was trapped. The forest had led her here, and there was nowhere else to go. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Rebecca's pulse spiked. She was too close to the truth now. The fear, the ancient power she had felt earlier, had all been leading her to this moment. A figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything she could name. It was a mass of darkness, shifting and writhing, with eyes that gleamed like molten lava, glowing with malevolent intent. Rebecca froze, her body frozen with terror. The creature was tall, towering, and its presence was suffocating, a palpable weight pressing down on her chest. It stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The ground beneath its feet cracked as if the earth itself feared the thing. As it drew closer, Rebecca could feel the temperature drop, the air becoming heavy with a thick, oppressive energy. "You shouldn't have come here," the creature hissed, its voice a low, guttural growl that reverberated in her bones. Rebecca's blood ran cold as she struggled to breathe. She knew, without a doubt, that this was the force she had been running from. The creature, the one that had been watching her, waiting for her, was here, and it was time to face it. The world seemed to fade around her as the creature's eyes locked onto hers. The whispers in the air were now deafening, like a chorus of voices that had once been human, now twisted and broken. "You've disturbed the balance," the creature said. "You've broken the rules." Rebecca's mind raced, trying to grasp what was happening, but her thoughts were clouded by fear and confusion. The balance. The rules. What did it mean? "What are you?" Rebecca managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. The creature's eyes flashed with something resembling amusement. "I am what you fear most. I am what lies beyond your understanding. You've awakened me, and now you will serve the price." The ground rumbled again, and Rebecca's knees buckled as the air grew heavier. Her vision blurred, but she forced herself to stay focused. She couldn't let herself break down now. She had come this far. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "There has to be another way. Please, let me go. I didn't mean to disturb anything. I just want to survive." The creature let out a low, rumbling laugh. "Survival? There is no survival here. This place doesn't allow it. You should have stayed away. Now, you will be part of the forest, part of the power that you sought to escape." Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest as she realized what the creature was saying. She wasn't meant to survive. No one was. The forest was a prison, a place where souls were trapped, lost to the darkness, bound by the ancient force that controlled it. The air around her began to shimmer, as if the very fabric of reality was twisting and bending. The creature raised a hand, and Rebecca's body seized up. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was like the life was being sucked out of her, leaving her weak and powerless. "Now you will join the others," the creature whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "The price has been paid." But just as Rebecca thought it was all over, a flicker of light caught her eye, a flash of something bright and fleeting. Her pulse surged with a sudden surge of energy. The whispers grew louder, but this time they were no longer full of dread. With a burst of strength, Rebecca fought back. She forced her body to move, pulling against the creature's grasp with every ounce of willpower she had left. Her mind screamed at her to move, survive, escape. In a last-ditch effort, she reached deep inside herself, searching for something, anything, that could break her free. And then, she found it. A crack in the creature's hold. A weakness. With one final, desperate surge, Rebecca pushed herself forward, breaking free of the grip that held her. The creature howled in fury, but she was already moving, running toward the stone wall that blocked her path. She reached the wall, her hands finding purchase on the rough stone, and with every ounce of strength left in her, she pulled herself up. And as she reached the top, the creature's roar echoed through the forest. The darkness began to pull back, retreating like a receding tide. The whispers, the growls, everything that had hunted her, all of it faded into the distance. For the first time in what felt like forever, Rebecca found herself standing on the other side, breathing in the cool air of freedom. She didn't know where she was, or what would happen next. But one thing was clear, she had survived. And as she disappeared into the unknown, the ancient force that had once held her in its grip was nothing more than a shadow in her past. Rebecca had escaped. But the forest would wait. It always did.